That morning in Washington, the White House cabinet room wasn't noisy, but the air was thick like the stillness before a storm. On the table lay stacks of heavy documents, commodity market maps, and copper price charts stretched out like a carpet of data. Donald Trump sat at the head of the table, his gaze betraying no hesitation. He flipped through pages of notes before looking up at the entire cabinet. He didn't begin with pleasantries. Instead, his voice rang out, firm and deliberate, as if every word had been weighed in advance. We will impose a 50% tariff on all imported copper. This decision takes effect immediately. One sentence, yet it was like a hammer striking the chessboard of global trade. He invoked Section 232, a national security provision typically reserved for situations where the U.S. believes the supply of a strategic commodity is under threat. Trump spoke of protecting the domestic mining industry, of the potential dangers in relying on foreign copper. He stressed that this was not a sudden blow, but an economic defense measure to ensure America's self-reliance. Even so, glances flickered across the room, surprise mingled with concern. The Trump administration was no stranger to aggressive protectionist measures, from steel and aluminum to automobiles. But choosing copper, a metal that rarely makes front-page economic headlines, left many stunned. This wasn't gold or oil, the usual suspects in loud, headline-grabbing crises. Copper had long been considered the quiet metal of the economy, everywhere yet seldom mentioned. And for that very reason, slapping a 50% tariff on it was like striking the surface of seemingly calm water, sending ripples outward in unpredictable directions. The news quickly left the room, slipping past security barriers into the ears of the press. Within hours, commodity markets roiled. Phones rang non-stop in manufacturing companies from Detroit to California. International financial networks blasted the headline, U.S. imposes 50% tariff on imported copper, unprecedented shock to metal trade. Some commentators called it a bold strategic move, while others saw it as a trap of America's own making. But amid the noisy debate, a bigger question began to emerge. How could a metal as overlooked as copper become the epicenter of a global economic and political storm? The answer lies in its very nature, a metal that not only conducts electricity, but also carries the lifeblood of the modern economy. And to understand why Trump's decision could ignite a chain reaction of disruptions, we need to look deeper into the strategic role copper holds in the global economic system. Copper isn't as glamorous as gold, nor is it priced daily like oil, yet it is woven into every corner of modern life. From the slender wires running through your home's walls to the massive coils stretching for dozens of kilometers between substations, from the intricate circuit boards inside a smartphone to the pipelines in a chemical plant, all require copper. If oil is the lifeblood carrying energy throughout the economic body, then copper is the nervous system, ensuring the smooth transmission of energy, data, and signals. Just imagine a world without copper. Cities plunged into darkness, production lines halted, telecommunications frozen, and electric vehicles reduced to motionless hunks of metal. That's why industrial experts have long called copper the metal of all metals, irreplaceable and indispensable. No one understands this better than the United States. For decades, Washington has considered copper a strategic resource, placing it among the materials that must have a secure, stable supply. This is not only due to its importance in civilian industries, but also its pivotal role in national defense. Radar systems, military communications equipment, warships, aircraft, all rely on large amounts of copper to function under any conditions. Depending on foreign sources of copper is, in essence, handing over a piece of national security, a risk American strategic planners have always regarded with caution. Donald Trump's decision, at least in theory, reflects that concern. In an era when global supply chains are increasingly unstable, from pandemics to geopolitical conflicts, protecting domestic copper mining and refining capacity can be seen as a defensive move. Furthermore, the U.S.'s strategic rivalry with China has only heightened its vigilance. For years, Beijing has not only tightened control over rare earth resources, but has also expanded its reach into copper mines in Africa, South America, and Asia. However, the global economy is not a chessboard where each piece moves in a single, predictable direction. A measure aimed at safeguarding domestic security can instantly trigger unintended consequences. especially when supply chains are tightly interwoven across nations. The global copper market, already strained by surging demand from green technologies, now faces an additional shock from U.S. tariffs. This not only unsettles importers, but forces America's long-standing partners to consider their own defenses. And the swiftest, most forceful reaction came from the country long considered Washington's most reliable partner in this field, Canada. Canada. Just hours after Trump's announcement, Ottawa countered with a cold, calculated move that opened a new, tense chapter in North American trade relations. In that moment, the seemingly unbreakable supply chain between the continent's two largest economies began to show its first cracks. Canada's response came so fast that both the markets and the White House were caught off guard. Just hours after Trump signed the tariff order, Ottawa announced a complete freeze on all copper export contracts to the U.S. and canceled existing transport agreements with American smelting and manufacturing corporations. Overnight, America's largest and most stable source of copper, accounting for nearly 40% of total imports, was cut off. Until then, the copper supply network between the two countries had been likened to a lifeline running across the border. From the mines in British Columbia and Ontario, copper ore would be processed in smelters, then shipped to the U.S. by rail or truck. From American ports and warehouses, the material flowed straight into production lines in Detroit, Houston, or Silicon Valley, where it became electrical wiring, circuit boards, or machine components serving both domestic and export markets. The process was so seamless that many businesses took it for granted until Canada, holding the valve, turned it tightly shut. Ottawa's motive wasn't merely to retaliate against a tariff. In recent years, Canada had been preparing for a future less dependent on the U.S. market, especially after seeing Washington impose steel, aluminum, and lumber tariffs without warning. This decision was both a warning shot and a trial run for a broader diversification strategy, expanding exports to Europe and Asia and deepening ties with emerging economies. Port infrastructure projects in British Columbia, new rail links to deep water terminals, and plans for fresh bilateral trade agreements all had been in the works long before. Trump's tariff simply gave Canada the excuse to accelerate. And in a world where supply chains are being reshaped by geopolitical tension, positioning itself as a global copper export hub put Canada in its strongest negotiating stance yet. For the U.S., this was a blow to a critical weak point. Not only did it lose its largest supplier, but Washington now faced the likelihood that remaining partners, from Chile to Peru, would seize the opportunity to raise prices or demand more favorable terms. The North American market, accustomed to stability and fluidity, now resembled a machine that had run smoothly for years, but suddenly lost a crucial gear. American factories began sounding alarms over dwindling inventories, pending orders were put on hold, and construction contractors worried about spiraling material costs. Across industrial zones from the Midwest to the Pacific Coast, tension rose. Production managers called emergency meetings to recalculate costs, while corporate procurement teams scrambled to secure alternative sources. But copper is not easily replaced, and shifting imports cannot be done overnight. All these disruptions pushed the market into a new spiral, a spiral of prices. In just a matter of days, copper prices in the U.S. began to soar, breaking away from global benchmarks. And from there, the domino effect became inevitable. Key manufacturing sectors began feeling the shock in every contract, every purchase order, every quotation. What followed would not just be numbers on a chart, but real upheaval in every factory, every construction site, every finished product rolling off the line. This was the moment the price shock began to sweep through, forcing American industry to confront a chaos unlike anything it had faced before. In just one night, copper prices on New York exchanges shot up to levels unseen in years, $6 per pound, a 13% jump from the previous day. That figure might look like a simple market fluctuation, but for American manufacturers, it was a blade slicing into every contract and production plan. The price gap between the US market and the London Metal Exchange, usually only a few percentage points, suddenly widened to 25%, making America the most expensive place in the world to buy copper. The electric vehicle sector was among the first to take the hit. An average EV uses 4 times more copper than a gasoline-powered car, in its electric motors, wiring systems, and fast charging units. When copper prices rise, production costs instantly soar by thousands of dollars per vehicle. Several EV factory expansion projects were put on hold, and some planned model launches were postponed indefinitely. CFOs worried not only about higher costs, but about competitiveness. How could they sell cars when prices were pushed up while rivals in Europe and Asia kept theirs lower? The energy sector, especially renewables, was also caught in the spiral. Wind turbines, substations, solar panels, all require large amounts of copper wiring for transmission and connections. Rising raw material costs inflated offshore wind farm and solar project budgets by tens of millions of dollars. For projects financed through bank loans, the sudden cost increase threw financial plans off balance, forcing developers to renegotiate contracts or even halt construction. Electronics and construction fared no better. From network cabling in data centers and computer circuit boards to piping systems in skyscrapers, all felt the chain reaction. Many contractors considered alternative materials, but not every application can forego copper. Some public works projects were delayed while maintenance and infrastructure repair costs climbed. Under pressure, U.S. companies scrambled to adapt. Some sought copper from new suppliers in South America or Africa, accepting higher shipping costs. Others turned to domestic scrap copper, recycling and refining it for reuse. A few even tried to bend the rules by routing imports through third countries and relabeling origins to avoid tariffs. A high legal risk, but a short-term lifeline for contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. While a handful of businesses managed to adjust, most were trapped in a dilemma. They couldn't cut output without losing market share, but keeping old prices meant immediate losses. This pressure pushed many small and mid-sized firms, entirely reliant on stable supply and reasonable raw material costs, into a precarious state. Wire factories in Ohio, component workshops in Texas, and machinery companies in Michigan began weighing shorter shifts or even layoffs to keep cash flow alive. The chaos wasn't just in numbers and charts, it was in the psyche. The market was uneasy. Businesses were uneasy. Workers were uneasy. A tariff decision once hailed as a strategic move was now generating ripples that were hard to contain. And like any storm, it would leave behind both winners and losers. The question was, who would rise and who would be swept away in this copper tempest? The answer would emerge in the days ahead, where gains and losses would be drawn not along clear lines, but by each player's capacity to adapt and the sharpness of their strategic vision. Amid the turbulence, there were still those quietly smiling. In states like Arizona, Utah, and Montana, once slow copper mines suddenly became the center of attention. High prices sent profits soaring, prompting operators to ramp up production, hire more workers, and restart mines once abandoned because costs were too high. The domestic copper scrap recycling industry also entered a golden age. Facilities that had once operated just enough to keep cash flow steady now became prized suppliers, landing contracts from major corporations that had previously paid them little notice. But the winners were few. The rest, especially manufacturing companies, were straining to survive. Wire, motor, and electronic circuit board factories were losing contracts to foreign competitors with access to cheaper copper. Small and mid-sized firms, lacking the capacity to stockpile materials or negotiate better prices, found themselves caught in a vice. Rising input costs on one side, customers unwilling to accept higher prices on the other. Many had to lay off staff, shift part of their production overseas, or shut down entirely. The impact on jobs became stark within just a few months. Once bustling industrial parks in the Midwest now had silent warehouses, job postings replaced with temporarily closed signs. Each lost position wasn't just a statistic, it was a family without income, a mortgage or tuition payment suddenly heavier. The effects even spilled into seemingly unrelated sectors. As American contractors lost bids due to high costs, companies in Vietnam, Thailand, and India picked up the contracts. Some U.S. infrastructure projects even ended up importing equipment from Asia. A bitter irony, given that the original purpose of the tariff policy was to protect domestic production. In business circles, talk turned to a survival lesson for uncertain times. Either adapt quickly to the new cost structure or pivot into markets and industries less dependent on copper. But not everyone had the time, capital, or vision to make the shift. And as the gap between survivors and casualties grew sharper, a larger question began to echo beyond America's borders. Would this copper storm stop at the US frontier, or would it pull the entire world into a new spiral of trade wars? That question was no distant speculation. Reactions from across the Atlantic, from Asia, and from emerging economies had already begun to surface, signals of a possible new wave of trade confrontation. And this time, the United States would not be the only one under pressure. From Brussels, the European Commission swiftly issued a warning. America's copper tariff policy was undermining the principles of fair trade and running counter to its commitments under the WTO framework. Legal experts in Luxembourg began examining the possibility of bringing a case against Washington at the International Trade Court. In Berlin and Paris, closed-door meetings between economic ministers were held around the same question. If the U.S. is willing to tax a strategic commodity like copper today, will steel, aluminum, or lithium batteries still be safe tomorrow? In Beijing, the reaction took a different shape. Rather than openly protesting, China quietly seized the opportunity. As global copper prices dipped slightly on weaker U.S. demand, Chinese companies immediately moved to buy in bulk, signing long-term contracts with mines in Africa and South America. By purchasing at lower prices, Beijing not only secured vast reserves of raw material, but also boosted its competitive edge in export manufacturing. In this game, they didn't need to fire a single political shot to reap the rewards. In South America, resource-rich nations like Chile and Peru proceeded with caution. They saw the chance to raise prices and negotiate better terms with buyers, but also feared being pulled into a spiral of trade retaliation. Some countries began discussing the adoption of similar protectionist measures to safeguard their own strategic resources, raising the risk of a domino effect, the very scenario international trade organizations have long warned about. Viewed more broadly, the picture began to evoke the dark days of the 1930s, when the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act triggered a cascade of protectionist escalations, helping drive the world deeper into the Great Depression. When a major economy raises tariff walls, its partners rarely stand still. They strike back, sometimes not just with trade measures, but by forging new alliances to reduce dependence. International analysts now worry that if the U.S. continues on this path, the fragmentation of global supply chains will accelerate. Instead of a wide-open trading network, the world could slide into a system of closed trade blocs, with each group of countries building its own supply base and markets. In such a world, production costs would climb, innovation would slow, and nations left outside these blocs would suffer the most. And here lies the painful question. Is Washington trading away too much for a strategic gain that is far from certain? If this situation drags on, the U.S. will face not only pushback from allies and rivals alike, but also the reality of a reshaped trading order, one in which its leadership position is no longer a given. In such a climate, what lies ahead, and what lessons could possibly guide America and the world in rethinking their strategies in the face of such unpredictable upheaval? The future of this copper war remains an open question, but the possible scenarios are already taking shape. If Washington insists on maintaining the 50% tariff for years, American businesses will be forced to adapt by ramping up domestic mining, expanding recycling, or seeking substitute materials. That would be a costly process, requiring time, investment capital, and technological innovation. Any strategic benefit, if it comes at all, would only emerge after years of persistence. The real question is whether the U.S. economy and society can withstand the immediate pressures long enough to see it through. Another possibility is that the administration will be compelled to back down as economic and political pressure mounts. Pushback from major industries combined with demands from heavily affected states could drive the White House to seek a compromise, lowering tariffs or granting exemptions for certain partners. Should that happen, it would serve as a reminder that even a powerful economy cannot unilaterally rewrite the rules of global supply chains without paying a price. A third path cannot be ruled out. Businesses discovering creative ways to reduce dependence on pure copper, from applying hybrid materials to developing copper-saving technologies. History has seen more than one resource crisis turn into a catalyst for technological breakthroughs. and perhaps this copper shock could become such a turning point. Whatever the outcome, the strategic lesson is clear. In a tightly interconnected world, extreme protectionism can backfire, turning short-term advantage into a long-term burden. Rather than erecting high walls, working with allies to secure strategic supplies remains the more sustainable path, one that strengthens economic security while preserving leadership on the global stage. At the same time, every nation must recognize that control over a critical resource depends not just on reserves, but on the ability to coordinate, negotiate, and share benefits. Today's copper war could be the warning bell for many crises yet to come. It reminds us that in the game of global power, no decision exists in a vacuum. Every action triggers a reaction, and true strength lies not only in winning the moment, but in keeping the board intact when the storms begin to rise. From a decision announced in just a few minutes in Washington, the United States has set itself in motion through a chain reaction whose consequences have spread far beyond expectations. From the cabinet room to copper mines in Montana, from EV assembly lines in Detroit to trading floors in London, and further still to mineral deposits in Chile, Zambia, and the Congo, all have been touched by a single number: 50%. That tariff hasn't just shifted price charts. It's shaken the foundations of trade relationships, partner trust, and even America's standing in the global economic order. Looking back, the picture clearly has two sides. On one side lies the argument for economic security, ensuring self-reliance in supply to avoid dependence on foreign sources. On the other is the reality that global supply chains are now so tightly interwoven that any attempt to cut loose inevitably causes powerful and unpredictable shocks. Somewhere, U.S. domestic mines are enjoying windfalls, but elsewhere factories are closing, workers are losing jobs, and contracts are falling into competitors' hands. On the international chessboard, rival powers have quietly seized the moment to expand their supply networks, strengthen strategic positions, and extend their influence. We can't yet declare this a mistake or a masterstroke. History has shown that some decisions, controversial at first, prove beneficial in the long run. But it has also shown that overconfidence, the belief that one can stand alone, has cost great powers dearly. What's certain is that this copper war has become a major test of America's economic adaptability, the resilience of its trade alliances, and the patience of the global market. Now, the question isn't just for policymakers in Washington, it's for all of us. Is this a wise step to safeguard the future, or a stumble that has left America tangled in its own net? Will the strategy of cutting away a piece of flesh to protect the body truly make the body stronger, or will it leave a wound slow to heal? I want to hear your thoughts. Share your views in the comments. Do you agree or disagree with this decision, and why? Who do you think will truly benefit from the copper war, and who will lose the most? If you found this analysis valuable and wanting to keep following in-depth geopolitical stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss new content. Because on the world's chessboard, every move has a cause and a consequence. And only when we understand each move can we read the entire game.